How many times have you caught yourself looking at someone else's life and thinking, why is mine so different? While others are achieving things, you're still waiting. While some people are getting married, traveling, and succeeding, you feel stuck in the same place, like life has passed you by. We live in a time where everything feels rushed. Social media constantly shows us other people's smiles, their wins, their highlight reels. But what no one shows is the process. What no one tells you is that every heart carries its own struggle, and every miracle happens at the right time. When we start measuring our lives by someone else's timeline, something inside us starts to break down. Comparison, disguised as inspiration, becomes a burden. Doubts fill our minds. Our hearts shut down. Our faith grows weak. And that's where anxiety is born. It doesn't come from what you don't have. It comes from what you believe you should have by now, but hasn't happened yet. It comes from that feeling of being behind, of being out of place. But are you really behind? Or are you exactly where God wants you to be? The story you're about to hear is about a woman who faced that exact dilemma. Clara was just an ordinary person, like you and me. Hardworking, honest, full of dreams, but tired of waiting. She thought God had forgotten her. That everything around her was moving, except her life. What she didn't know was that, even in the silence, God was already stitching together a new beginning. And if you're in that same season where everything feels stuck, stay with me. Because in the next few minutes, you'll realize that the waiting isn't a punishment, it's preparation. And what's being formed in silence might just surprise you. Oh, and if you want to walk with us on this journey of faith, hope, and transformation, now's the perfect time to subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is a seed that can bloom inside you. Ready to dive in? Because it's time to meet Clara, the woman who discovered the beauty of waiting on God's perfect timing. Clara lived on a quiet street, in a small house with blue doors and walls worn down by time. Inside, there was a tiny sewing workshop. Between folded fabrics, colorful threads, and an old foot-pedal sewing machine, she spent her days. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her as a calm, hardworking woman, always ready to lend a hand. But what few people knew was that Clara felt invisible. She watched her neighbors get married, her friends start businesses, others travel, buy cars, change their lives. And her, she stayed right there. Hemming pants, altering dresses, stitching up clothes no one even thanked her for. Her work was honest, but her dreams felt forgotten. The days dragged on. Everything stayed the same. And sometimes, the silence in her house screamed louder than she could bear. Many nights, Clara found herself quietly crying at the end of the day. Not out of ungratefulness, but because something felt missing. It was like life had skipped over her, like God had gotten busy with everyone else and left her waiting in a line that never moved. She prayed. She always had. But over time, her prayers grew shorter. More tired. They started with faith and ended as a cry for help. Lord, when will it be my turn? Deep down, Clara carried a heart bruised by comparison. She didn't envy others, but she blamed herself for not keeping up with the pace of the world. Every engagement announcement, every success story made her shrink a little more. She started to wonder if something was wrong with her. If she just wasn't good enough, capable enough, blessed enough. Time, once her ally, now felt like an enemy. The clock hands moved for everyone else, but not for her. Every birthday that came and went seemed to take a little more hope with it. But what Clara didn't realize was that, even when it felt like nothing was happening, God was still there, watching every tear she cried in silence, hearing every whispered prayer between stitches, and, in his own way, preparing an answer, one that would come at exactly the right time. An answer that would begin, in the most unexpected way. In the next few minutes, you'll see that what feels invisible to the world is often far too precious to go unnoticed by God. Clara was about to learn that. And maybe you are too. It was late afternoon when Clara, as she always did, sat by her bedroom window. That spot was her little refuge, where she rested and observed. From there, she could see the whole street. The comings and goings of neighbors, kids playing, people chatting, and sometimes, the dreams of others unfolding right before her eyes. That day, she saw a couple who had just moved into the house on the corner unloading brand new furniture. They were laughing, snapping pictures, making plans out loud. Across the street, flowers were delivered to Mrs. Marlene's house, an anniversary gift from her husband. In the distance, the joyful laughter of a neighbor's daughter echoed as she celebrated getting accepted into college. Clara watched it all in silence. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes, though open, seemed lost in a different place. Inside her, a quiet question was slowly growing. Why does it happen for everyone else, but not for me? She wasn't angry or jealous. It was a mix of sadness and confusion. She felt like someone sitting in the audience of life, watching happiness happen to everyone else, never being called to the stage. That feeling of always being last, of being forgotten, lingered like a shadow. That night, she didn't sew. She turned off the lights early, lay in bed, and staring up at the ceiling, she spoke to God. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Do you see me?" It was a short prayer, heavy with pain. She wasn't asking for immediate answers, just a sign that she hadn't been forgotten. Clara didn't want much. Just to feel that her time would still come. And then, in the quiet, something different happened. The next morning, earlier than usual, she heard the bell above the shop door ring. Rarely did anyone show up that early. When she opened the door, she saw a tall man with a simple look, wearing a modest blazer and holding a small package in his hands. "Good morning," he said, with a calm smile. "I was told you so with care. I have a special request." Clara, a bit surprised, invited him in. He placed the bundle on the table and began to explain. He didn't just want a piece of clothing. He wanted something made with time, with delicacy. A ceremonial cloak, for an important event, full of subtle details. At first, Clara hesitated. It was unlike anything she'd ever done. But there was something about his voice. Something that calmed her. That made her feel safe. "I trust your hands," he said. And without realizing it, that phrase was like a seed planted in Clara's heart. For the first time in a long while, someone wasn't asking her for quick fixes, cheap prices, or last-minute alterations. Someone believed she could create something meaningful. Someone saw something special in her. And maybe, just maybe, God did too. For years, Clara had sewn ordinary pieces, hems, alterations, party dresses, school uniforms. Always with care, always with respect. But this order was different. The cloak the man had requested was rich in detail, made of fine fabric, and had a structure that demanded attention, patience, and time. It wasn't something to be rushed. It was a piece to be built in silence, stitch by stitch, as if every thread carried a greater meaning. She spent the first few days just studying the fabric. She ran her fingers over its softness, watched how it subtly shimmered in the afternoon light. She thought about the challenge, yes, but there was something deeper happening. It was as if she were being invited to reconnect with herself. With every sketch and pattern, she remembered who she used to be, who she dreamed of becoming, before comparison made her doubt her worth. As she sewed, Clara didn't just hear the hum of the machine. She started hearing herself again. And in that silence, almost without noticing, God began to speak. Not out loud. Not in some miraculous or extraordinary way. But in gentle thoughts, like a soft breeze on a quiet morning. You're not late. You haven't been forgotten. What's yours is being prepared. These words came like whispers, as she stitched each piece together. And the more she worked, the more she realized that this cloak wasn't just for the client. In a way, it was for her too. A journey of restoration. Every detail brought back something she thought she'd lost: her courage, her creativity, her confidence. One night, after finishing one of the most delicate embroideries, she paused for a moment, holding the garment in her hands, overwhelmed. Not with pride, but with gratitude. It felt like, through this task, God had chosen to show her that there was still beauty in her hands, meaning in her story, and purpose in the waiting. She still didn't know exactly who the man was. He had come with such simplicity, almost as if he didn't want to be noticed. But there was something about his presence, something full of intention. And now, Clara understood that his visit wasn't random. It was an answer. While many wait for answers through big, dramatic moments, sometimes God responds with a needle, a thread, and a task done with love. And the most beautiful part was still to come. The days began to feel different. What used to be routine had become revelation. Clara would wake up early, make her coffee, and sit at her sewing machine as if entering a sacred space. It wasn't just sewing anymore, it was prayer. Every stitch was a conversation with God. Every piece of embroidery, an act of trust. The cloak was taking shape, but the real transformation was happening in her heart. She started to notice subtle changes within herself. That old anxiety she used to feel when looking out the window was gone. She no longer compared herself to her neighbors or to the curated smiles on social media. Her focus had shifted inward, because that's where the true miracle was unfolding. One day, while embroidering one of the final details, Clara paused and looked around her tiny workshop. Everything was simple. The sewing machine was old. The furniture, modest. But there was peace. And that was new. A peace not tied to what she saw, but to what she felt. She smiled. And for the first time in a long time, it was a genuine smile. In the middle of the process, old customers began to return. People who had disappeared came back with compliments and new requests. Some even said, "There's something different about you, Clara. This place feels lighter, warmer." And she knew. She knew it was God responding, not with haste, but with purpose. The waiting hadn't been in vain. The comparison had faded, because she had finally understood that her journey was her own. That other people's timelines weren't hers. And that God's timing is always perfect. Without realizing it, Clara had stopped sewing just for others. She was stitching her own story, thread by thread, with faith and gratitude. Each day, she felt more alive, more grounded, more whole. And then came the moment of the delivery. The piece was finished. Beautiful. Clara looked at it, eyes filled with tears. Not out of pride for what she'd made, but because she knew it represented everything God had restored within her. The sky was clear that morning. Clara woke up with her heart racing, but it wasn't anxiety. It was a calm kind of joy, the kind you feel when you know something important is about to happen. The cloak was carefully folded, placed inside a box lined with white fabric. This wasn't just a delivery. It was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. She arrived at the address the client had given her, a simple church, with open gates and fresh flowers decorating the entrance. There was movement all around, people smiling, preparing the space for a special ceremony. Clara approached, holding the box close to her chest, and was greeted by a kind woman who led her to the front of the church. As she stepped inside, her eyes locked on the man waiting for her. It was the same man who had placed the order. But now, he looked different. He wore ceremonial garments, and everyone around him treated him with deep respect. Clara immediately understood he wasn't just a customer. He was the pastor of that congregation. And the cloak she had made would be worn at his ordination into pastoral ministry. The pastor greeted her with a wide smile and a respectful embrace. "You have no idea how much this cloak means to me," he said. "It's not just clothing, it's part of a calling. And I prayed for God to show me who should make it. He led me to you." Clara felt her knees weaken. Her heart was pounding. In that moment, it was as if every question she had ever whispered in lonely nights was being answered all at once. The pastor continued, "When I walked into your shop, I saw more than a seamstress. I saw someone God had hidden for a while, but never forgotten. Sometimes He keeps us in silence to prepare us. And when the time is right, He reveals. And He lifts us up." Tears streamed down Clara's face. It felt like every word was being sown directly into her soul. She hadn't been seeking recognition, but in that moment, in front of everyone, she received something far greater, confirmation. The cloak was worn with honor. And at the end of the ceremony, the pastor called Clara to the front and thanked her publicly. "This woman taught me, without even knowing, that when we wait on God's timing, He always shows up with something better than we imagined." That day, Clara walked home with an empty box, but a heart full. And something deep within her had changed forever. The days that followed the delivery of the cloak were unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. Not because of the recognition she received, but because of the clarity that now lived inside her. For the first time, she felt no rush. No pressure to compare. She no longer sat by the window wondering why everyone else's life seemed to be moving faster than hers. She knew she was finally living in God's timing. The workshop, once quiet and still, had become a space of connection and growth. Moved by a higher inspiration, Clara decided to open the doors of her small home to teach other women how to sew. But more than stitching fabric, she wanted to teach them how to trust. How to look at their own hands and see worth. How to stop racing against time and start walking in faith. That's how her project, Stitched with Purpose, was born. There, women who felt forgotten, overlooked, or simply tired, found a place to begin again. Clara shared her story with simplicity, no embellishments. She showed them the rushed pieces she used to make, and the cloak she made with full surrender. She spoke about comparison, about waiting, and about how even in silence, God had never stopped being present. The sewing lessons became healing sessions. Between stitches and conversations, stories were mended. lives began to bloom. One day, a young student asked Clara, "How did you know it was your time?" And with a calmness in her eyes, Clara answered, "I didn't. I just stopped looking at everyone else's clock and started listening to God's heart." Clara had learned that God's timing is like a well-made garment. It takes time, it requires care, but in the end, everything fits just right. And that living your life in comparison is like wearing something tailored for someone else. It'll never truly fit. She was still sewing, still living in the same little house, still drinking the same simple coffee. But something essential had changed. She now knew her worth didn't lie in what she achieved, but in how much she trusted. And that's what this story wants to remind you of today. Don't compare. Don't rush. Don't give up. Trust. God's timing is perfect. He doesn't arrive early or late. And when He moves, even the years that felt lost are restored with beauty and purpose. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who's tired of waiting. And tell me in the comments, what has God been teaching you in this season? Because sometimes, the answer you've been searching for is being stitched together in silence. And when it's ready, it'll clothe you with purpose.